The professor pointed at the janitor in front of 300 students and said it like a joke, like a dare, like a way to put the old man in his place. You think you can solve it? This equation has defeated every doctoral student in this department for 2 years, but by all means. She held out the chalk, smirking, playing to the crowd. In fact, I'll make it interesting. Solve it and I'll marry you. That's how sure I am that you can't. The lecture hall roared with laughter. 300 phones came up to film the humiliation, and the janitor, 55 years old, in a gray work shirt, with his name stitched on the pocket, set down his mop and took the chalk and walked to the board. What Dr. Catherine Vaughn did not know, what none of them knew, was that the unsolvable equation on that board was not new. It was 30 years old. And the man picking up the chalk had seen it before, because he was the one who had first written it in another life before the world took everything from him and handed his genius to somebody else. Stay with me to the end of this one, because you are about to watch the most humiliating moment of an old man's life turn into the moment that finally gave him back the life that was stolen. And if a story about a hidden genius and long-delayed justice moves you the way it moves me, hit subscribe and ring that bell right now, because these get buried and you're the reason they get found. His name was Elijah Turner, and 30 years before he picked up that chalk, he had been the most gifted mathematician anyone at that university had ever seen. I know how that sounds. A janitor who used to be a genius. It sounds like a fairy tale. But the truth is that the world is full of Elijah Turners, brilliant people whose brilliance was drowned not by any lack of talent, but by the ordinary crushing weight of poverty and duty and other people's greed. And the only thing unusual about Elijah's story is that one Tuesday morning in a lecture hall, the drowning finally reversed. So let me tell you how a genius ends up holding a mop, because you cannot understand the equation without understanding the man, and you cannot understand the man without understanding what was taken. Elijah grew up poor, the oldest of 4 children in a home where his father was gone, and his mother worked 2 jobs. And there was never enough of anything except love, which there was a great deal of. And Elijah had a gift. It announced itself early the way real gifts do, unmistakable and slightly frightening. He saw numbers the way other people see color. Patterns that took his teachers a blackboard to work out arranged themselves in his head before the chalk touched the slate. A high school teacher, recognizing what she was looking at, pushed him, mentored him, helped him win a scholarship, and Elijah Turner, against every odd, stacked against a poor black kid from that neighborhood, made it to this very university as a mathematics student, and then dazzlingly into its doctoral program, where the faculty spoke of him in the hushed tones reserved for the rare student who is going to matter, who is going to change the field. He had a specialty, an area of pure mathematics, so abstract I will not pretend to explain it, except to say that it dealt with a class of problems that had resisted the best minds for generations, and that Elijah in his 3rd and 4th years had begun to see a way through them that no one else had seen. He developed a method, an approach, entirely his own, elegant and strange and powerful, and he began to apply it to a famous open problem in the field, and by his 5th year he was close, genuinely close to a proof that would have made his name and possibly reshaped a corner of mathematics. His dissertation was going to be one of those rare dissertations that people still cite decades later. His advisor, a well-regarded and ambitious professor named Alan Whitfield, told everyone that his student was going to be a star. And then Elijah's mother got sick. It was cancer, and it was bad, and there was no money, and there were 3 younger siblings still at home, the youngest only 12. And Elijah Turner, the star, the genius, 5 years into a doctorate, and months from a proof that would have changed his life, did the math that no equation prepares you for. He was the oldest. He was the one. If he did not go home and work and hold the family together, and pay for what could be paid for, and care for a dying mother and raise his siblings, no one would. There was no one else. There was only him. There was a night before he left that Elijah never spoke about to anyone, and it was the night the decision actually got made, alone at a desk at 3 in the morning. He had the proof almost finished. He could feel it the way you feel the last piece of a puzzle in your hand before you set it down, the shape of the thing complete in his mind. Weeks of work at most, from being written up and defended and published, from a life as a mathematician, from everything he had clawed his way toward against every odd. And on the desk beside the notebook was a letter from home about his mother's diagnosis and the bills, and his 12-year-old sister who had stopped talking since the news. And Elijah Turner sat between the proof and the letter for a long time in the dark, doing the only calculation that has no elegant solution, the one where every answer costs you something you cannot get back. And he chose the letter. He closed the notebook. He did not know closing it that he would not open that life again for 30 years, that closing it that night was the quiet, unwitnessed hinge on which his entire existence would turn. If he had known, he told Catherine much later, he still would have chosen the letter. That was the thing he needed her to understand. He never once regretted choosing his family. What he could not forgive was that the world made it a choice at all, and then having made him choose, stole the thing he set down. So he left. I told himself it was temporary, a leave of absence, that he would finish the proof and the degree when things settled. Things did not settle. His mother's illness was long and expensive, and it ended the only way it could. And by the time it was over, there were still 3 siblings to get through school, and rent and life, and the money a working man could earn was needed every single week. And the doctorate that required years of unpaid devotion receded further and further until it was not a plan anymore, but a grief. A road not taken, a life that had belonged to another version of himself who had died the day his mother got sick. And here is the part that turned grief into injustice. Elijah's advisor, Alan Whitfield, had access to all of Elijah's work. The notebooks, the method, the nearly complete proof, all of it left behind when Elijah walked away to save his family. And Alan Whitfield, ambitious and well-regarded and entirely without honor, did the thing that the powerless always have to fear from the powerful who took it. Over the next 2 years, Whitfield finished Elijah's proof using Elijah's own revolutionary method, and he published it under his own name with no mention of the student whose life's work it had been. It made Whitfield's career. It became in time a celebrated result, and the method underneath it. Elijah's method entered the field as Whitfield's approach taught to graduate students built upon by other mathematicians, a foundation stone of a corner of a discipline. Elijah found out by accident. He was 28, working 2 jobs, and he had gone to the public library on a rare Sunday, off and out of an ache he could not name. He had wandered to the mathematics journals, the way you press on a bruise to see if it still hurts, and he had picked up a recent issue, and there it was, his proof, his method. His years of work laid out almost exactly as he had left it in the notebooks, under the name Alan Whitfield, with a note thanking various colleagues, and no mention, not one word, of the student who had invented all of it. Elijah stood in the quiet of that library holding the journal, and the room went very far away, and he understood in a single sick rush exactly what had been done to him, and that there was nothing at all that he could do about it. Who would believe him? A young black man with no degree working double shifts, claiming that a distinguished white professor's famous result was actually his. He could hear how it would sound. He could see the pitying faces. He put the journal down, and he put his head down on the library table, and he wept silently so as not to disturb anyone, the way he had learned to do everything, and then he wiped his face and went to his second job, because weeping does not pay rent. And a 12-year-old sister who had started talking again needed her school shoes. He never went back to that library. And every brick of Whitfield's approach, celebrated in journals and taught in seminars for 30 years, had been laid by a young man who read about his own stolen triumph and then went and clocked in for the night shift. Because that is what Elijah had become. Life is relentless, and the years pass, and a man who leaves the academic track at 25 does not get back on it at 40. And Elijah Turner worked the jobs that were available to a man with no degree and no time, and he was good at all of them because he was Elijah, and eventually through the specific irony that the universe seems to enjoy. He took a steady job with good benefits as a night custodian, and the job happened to be at a university, and eventually through a transfer at this university, the very one that had once called him a star. Cleaning the very mathematics building where he had once been going to change the world. He never told anyone at the university who he had been. What would he say? Who would believe him? He had made his peace, or a version of peace, with the road not taken. He had raised his siblings. All 3 had good lives, one a nurse, one a teacher, one who owned a small business, and Elijah was proud of that with his whole heart, and he told himself most days that a family raised was worth more than a proof published, and most days he even believed it. But he could not stop doing mathematics. That was the thing. You can take a man's career and his credit and his degree, but you cannot take the way his mind works, and Elijah's mind still saw numbers the way other people see color. And at night, alone in the empty mathematics building, mopping the floors of the lecture halls, he would look at the equations the professors and students had left on the chalkboards, the problems they were wrestling with, and he could not help himself. He would see the answer. I would stand there with his mop in the quiet and see straight through problems that had defeated rooms full of doctoral students. And sometimes when he could not resist, he would set down the mop and pick up the chalk, and in a corner of the board, quietly, anonymously leave a hint, a next step, an elegant little push in the right direction, and then he would erase the evidence that he'd been the one, or leave it unsigned and finish mopping and go home and tell no one. For years, this was Elijah's secret life, the ghost of the mathematics building. Professors would come in some mornings to find that someone had overnight cracked a step they'd been stuck on, and they assumed it was a colleague or a bright student or their own forgotten note, and no one ever imagined it was the quiet older man who emptied their wastebaskets, because no one ever imagines that about the quiet older man who empties their wastebaskets, which is the whole tragedy of the quiet older men who empty wastebaskets all over the world. And then Dr. Catherine Vaughn came to the department. Catherine Vaughn was brilliant and young for her position, and arrogant in the particular way of people who have been the smartest person in every room since childhood, and have never once had a reason to question whether being the smartest made them the wisest. She was a rising star, the kind the department was proud to have recruited, and she taught a demanding graduate seminar, and she had a flair for the dramatic that made her popular with students and sometimes careless with people. And Catherine Vaughn had become obsessed with a problem. It was as these things go, a descendant of the very result that had made Alan Whitfield famous 30 years before, a next-generation question that Whitfield's approach had opened up and that no one had been able to close. She had put it on the board of her seminar, a famously hard open problem, and challenged her doctoral students to make progress on it. And for 2 years it had defeated all of them, and it had become a kind of running saga in the department. Vaughn's impossible equation, the thing that humbled the brightest students year after year. What Catherine Vaughn did not know was that the problem was a descendant of Elijah's own stolen method, that its very DNA was his, that the Whitfield's approach she was building on had been born in the notebooks of the man who mopped her lecture hall at night. And so when Elijah Turner encountered Vaughn's impossible equation on the board during his rounds, he did not see an impossible equation. He saw a child of his own mind 30 years grown. He saw the exact place where his old method, if extended in a way he could see as clearly as his own hand, would crack it open. And for weeks, unable to help himself, he had been leaving anonymous progress on that board overnight, elegant steps in an unfamiliar hand pushing Vaughn's impossible problem steadily toward a solution that only he could see, because it was in the deepest sense only ever his to see. Catherine Vaughn was losing her mind over it, because someone was solving her problem. In pieces overnight, in a handwriting she didn't recognize, using her celebrated approach with a fluency and originality that outstripped anyone in her department, including, though she would not have admitted it herself. She assumed it was a student showing off than a rival colleague, then as the anonymous work grew more brilliant and more impossible to attribute to anyone she knew. She became genuinely rattled because the mathematics appearing on her board at night was better than her own, and she could not fathom who was producing it, and the not knowing gnawed at her ego like acid. So she set a trap. She told the department she was working late, and instead she hid one night in the dark tiered seats at the back of her own lecture hall, and she waited to catch the ghost. And a little after 2 in the morning, the door opened and the lights came on, and in walked a janitor with a mop and a cart, humming to himself. And Catherine Vaughn almost gave herself away by laughing, because obviously it wasn't him. Obviously the custodian was just here to clean, and she settled in to keep waiting for the real genius to arrive. The janitor mopped for a while, and then he stopped in front of the board, in front of Vaughn's impossible equation and the weeks of anonymous progress on it. And he stood there leaning on his mop, looking at it, and Catherine watched confused as the old man studied her problem with an attention that did not look like the incomprehension of a layman, but like something else entirely. And then Elijah Turner, believing himself alone as he had believed himself alone for years, set down his mop and picked up a piece of chalk and added 3 lines to the proof. 3 lines that leapt the problem forward, further than her entire seminar had managed in 2 years. 3 lines of such casual, devastating elegance that Catherine Vaughn, hidden in the dark, stopped breathing. The ghost was the janitor. The man she had walked past 100 times without seeing. She should have walked down and introduced herself. She should have said, "My God, who are you? Where did you learn this? What are you?" That is what a wise person would have done. But Catherine Vaughan was not yet wise. She was brilliant and arrogant, and in that moment profoundly threatened because her entire identity was built on being the smartest person in the room. And she had just watched the man who emptied her wastebasket casually surpass her in the one thing she believed made her exceptional. And instead of humility, she felt something uglier, and she made a decision she would spend a long time regretting. She decided to expose him, to confront him publicly, to make it a spectacle on her terms in her lecture hall in front of her students, where she would be in control of the narrative, because if this old custodian really was some kind of savant, she was going to be the one who discovered him. And if he wasn't, if it was some fluke or trick, she was going to humiliate him for it. And either way, the room would remember that she was the one who ran it. So she did not reveal herself that night. She planned it. And 2 days later, in front of 300 students in a packed lecture hall at the end of a session, spent going over the famous impossible problem, Catherine Vaughan looked up as the janitor came in to clean right on schedule, and she said sweetly, dangerously, "Actually, before you start, I wonder if you could help us. We've all been struggling with this equation for 2 years." The students turned. Elijah froze, copy in hand, and understood with a sinking heart that somehow she knew. "You seem to spend a lot of time in this room at night," Vaughan went on, playing to the crowd. "Maybe you've picked something up. You think you can solve it." And then, riding the laughter, she overreached the way arrogant people overreach at the exact moment they feel most in command, and she made the joke that would define the rest of both their lives. She held out the chalk, smirking. "In fact, I'll make it interesting. Solve it, and I'll marry you. That's how sure I am that you can't." The lecture hall roared. Phones came up. And Elijah Turner stood there in his gray work shirt with his name on the pocket, being laughed at by 300 young people in the building where he had once been called a star, and he faced the oldest choice of his life. Keep his head down. Mumble something. Take the humiliation and go the way he had taken every humiliation for 30 years. Or pick up the chalk. If you're holding your breath right now, if you need to watch the old man walk to that board, that feeling is exactly what this channel is built for, and the only way we keep making these is your tap on that subscribe button. Do it now, and watch what 30 years of silence looks like when it finally speaks. Elijah looked at the chalk in her outstretched hand, and he thought about his mother. And he thought about the proof he never got to publish, and the library where he'd read his own stolen work under another man's name, and the 3 siblings he'd raised, and the 30 years of emptying wastebaskets in the building where he was going to change the world. And he thought with a strange and sudden calm that he was 55 years old, and that he had spent his whole life protecting other people by staying quiet, and that there was no one left who needed protecting, and that maybe it was finally his turn. He set down the mop. The scrape of the handle against the tile was the only sound in a room that had been roaring a second before. He walked to the board. He took the chalk from Catherine Vaughan's hand, and up close she saw his eyes. And they were not the eyes of a man about to be humiliated. They were calm and sad and terribly intelligent, and something cold moved through her, the first cold breath of understanding what she had done. And Elijah Turner began to write. He did not start where the students had started. He went back, all the way back, and he rebuilt the foundation of the problem from the ground up. And within 4 lines, the laughter in the lecture hall had died, because even the first-year students could see that whatever this was, it was not a janitor bluffing. He wrote with the fluency of a native speaker returning to a mother tongue after decades in exile. And something happened in that lecture hall as he wrote something Catherine Vaughan would describe for the rest of her life. The mockery didn't just fade, it inverted. A graduate student in the 3rd row, one of Vaughan's best, the one who had struggled hardest with the problem, stood up halfway through. Not to object, but because he could not stay seated, because he could see where the old man was going, and it was a place none of them had known existed, and he whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough for the whole room to hear. The chalk kept moving. A hush came down over 300 people, and the phones that had come up to film. A humiliation kept filming, but the hands holding them had begun to shake because everyone in that room, from the first years to the professor, understood by degrees that they were not watching a stunt. They were watching mathematics being done at a level most of them would never reach by a man in a work shirt with his name stitched over the pocket, and the wrongness of that, the sheer impossible wrongness of it, was rearranging something in every person present. I took Vaughan's impossible equation, the one that had defeated 2 years of doctoral students, and he did not merely make progress on it, He solved it, completely, elegantly, in front of them all. He extended the celebrated method further than anyone in that room had known it could go, and he closed the problem with a final line. So clean and so inevitable that when he set down the chalk, there was for a moment absolute silence. The silence of 300 people who have just watched something they will tell their grandchildren about. And then he did the thing that turned a miracle into a reckoning. He did not put down the chalk and walk away. He turned to Catherine Vaughn and to the 300 students, and he said quietly, "You want to know how I did that so fast? It's because I've seen this before. Not this exact problem, but its parent. The method all of you call Whitfield's approach." He tapped the board. "I want to tell you something, and you can believe me or not, but there are notebooks if anyone ever cares to look in a storage box I've kept for 30 years that will show you I'm telling the truth. I developed that method 30 years ago in this department as a doctoral student, before I had to leave to take care of my dying mother and my little brothers and sisters. My advisor was a man named Alan Whitfield. When I left, he took my notebooks and he finished my proof, and he published it under his own name, and he built a career on it, and it became famous, and they named my method after him. I have spent 30 years cleaning the floors of the building where I invented the thing that made another man immortal." He looked at the equation he had just solved. "So when you put my own method's grandchild on that board and asked if the janitor could solve it, Dr. Vaughn, the answer was always going to be yes, because it was never really Whitfield's approach. It was mine. And this is the first time in 30 years anyone has watched me use it and known my name." Catherine Vaughn stood frozen at the front of her own lecture hall, and the arrogance had drained completely out of her. And in its place was a horror that had two layers. The first layer was the personal humiliation, the joke about marriage, the laughter she had orchestrated, all of it now curdled into shame. But the second layer was deeper, and to her credit, it was the one that hit her hardest, because Catherine Vaughn, whatever her flaws, genuinely loved mathematics, and she had just been told, and she believed it instantly because she had seen the proof with her own eyes, that the foundation stone of her entire field, the method she taught and revered and built her career upon, had been stolen from the man standing in front of her, holding a mop, and that a monstrous injustice had been sitting uncorrected at the root of her discipline for 3 decades. And this is where the story could have gone two ways, and it is to Catherine Vaughn's lasting credit which way she chose. She could have protected herself. She could have laughed it off, cast doubt on the old man's wild claim, protected the reputation of the celebrated Professor Whitfield, and by extension, the whole edifice she stood on. That is what most people would have done, because the truth was catastrophic and inconvenient and threatened the very ground she stood on. She did not do that. Catherine Vaughn looked at the completed proof on her board, and she looked at Elijah Turner, and she did the hardest thing a proud person can do, which is to let the truth matter more than her pride. She turned to her 300 students, and she said in a voice that shook, "I want every one of you to remember what you just saw, and I want you to remember it honestly, including the part where I mocked this man before he wrote a single line. Because I think we have just watched something that is going to require all of us to be very brave about the truth." She turned to Elijah. "You said there are notebooks." 30 years of them," Elijah said, "dated, in my handwriting, the whole development of the method years before Whitfield published. I kept them because they were all I had left of who I used to be. I never thought anyone would want to see them. I never thought anyone would believe a custodian." "I believe you," Catherine Vaughn said. "I watched you solve in 10 minutes what my best students couldn't touch in 2 years, using a method you clearly understand more deeply than anyone alive, including the man it's named after. I believe you completely, and I'm going to help you prove it publicly to everyone, whatever it costs me, because it is the truth, and because I owe you an apology so large that helping you get your life back is the only apology worth making. Now, let me tell you what happened after, because the ending held, and it is the part worth having. It was not simple, and it was not fast, because overturning 30 years of settled history and a dead or dying famous man's celebrated legacy is never simple. But the notebooks existed. Elijah brought them out of the storage box he had kept for 30 years through a dozen moves and a dozen hard winters. The one box he had never been able to throw away, even in the leanest times, because it held the only proof that the person he used to be had ever existed at all. There were 11 of them filled edge to edge in a young man's cramped, urgent hand, dated sequential. The whole development of the method laid out over years with the false starts and the crossings out, and the sudden breakthroughs that no forger could ever fabricate after the fact, because they were the fossil record of a mind actually inventing something. Catherine assembled a panel of experts to examine them, people whose integrity she trusted more than she trusted her own comfort, and Elijah sat in a room while three of the most respected mathematicians in the field turned the pages of his old notebooks in complete silence for the better part of an afternoon. And one of them, an elderly woman who had known and admired Alan Whitfield for 40 years, closed the last notebook and took off her glasses and sat for a long moment. And then she said to Elijah with tears standing in her eyes, "Young man, I have taught this method for 30 years. I have written about it. I have stood on it. And I am looking at it being born in your hand years before Alan ever published a word of it, and I am so ashamed of my whole profession that I can hardly speak. This is yours. It was always yours, and we are going to make it right, all of us, publicly, whatever it costs." She called him young man, though he was 55, because in the world of that method he had been frozen at 25 for 30 years, and she was in her way, welcoming him back to the age he should have been. When they were examined by experts, honestly, the notebooks told an unambiguous story. The method credited to Alan Whitfield had been fully developed years before his publication in the hand of his student, Elijah Turner. The mathematics itself, once people knew to look, confirmed it, because the notebooks contained false starts and evolutions, and a depth of understanding that no one could have reconstructed after the fact, the fingerprints of the true inventor. Catherine Vaughan, using every ounce of her considerable standing and her flair for making the field. Pay attention, championed the case relentlessly, and she brought in colleagues she trusted, and the evidence was overwhelming, and slowly. Then, not so slowly, the truth became undeniable. The record was corrected. It is a rare thing in this world, rarer than almost any other kind of justice, because the powerful spend their whole lives making sure the record is never corrected, and I want you to sit with how rare it is and how much it cost and how it only happened because one arrogant professor decided her love of the truth mattered more than her pride, and one old man finally decided it was his turn to speak. But it happened. The method was renamed to credit Elijah Turner 30 years late. The university, mortified and trying to do right, awarded Elijah the doctorate he had been months from earning 3 decades before, and then, understanding that this was not nearly enough, offered him a position, a real one, a chance to finally be what he had always been. And the students who had filmed the moment on their phones, meaning to capture a janitor's humiliation, had instead captured a genius's resurrection. And the video traveled far beyond that lecture hall, and the world for once got to watch an injustice be named and undone. Alan Whitfield was still alive, elderly, retired, decorated. He never fully admitted what he had done. Men like that rarely do. But the truth did not require his confession, because it had Elijah's notebooks, and Elijah's living, breathing genius demonstrated in front of 300 witnesses and a camera. His legacy was corrected in the only way that mattered, which was that the field would forever after know whose mind had actually done the work. And that is a heavier sentence for a man who stole another's immortality than any court could hand down. And Elijah Turner, at 55, 30 years late, finally got to be a mathematician. I was extraordinary at it, of course. He had always been extraordinary at it. But the thing that mattered most to him, the thing he cared about more than the corrected record or the belated degree or the position, was the students. Because Elijah Turner knew better than anyone alive how many geniuses are out there mopping floors, how many gifts are drowned by poverty and duty and theft, how many brilliant poor kids leave the track to save their families and never get back on. And he devoted the rest of his life to finding them and holding the door open the way one high school teacher had once held it open for him. He created a program funded partly by the university's guilt and partly by his own fierce will to find and support students from backgrounds like his students, who might have to choose between their gift and their family, and to make sure that wherever he could manage it, they never had to make the choice he had made. There was one in particular in the first year of the program, a young woman named Deja, who reminded Elijah so much of himself that it hurt to look at her. She was the most gifted student in her class, and she was on the verge of dropping out because her grandmother, who had raised her, was failing and there was no one else. And Deja had done the same cold arithmetic Elijah had done at that desk 30 years before and reached the same conclusion that she would have to set the gift down to hold the family up. She came to Elijah's office to tell him she was leaving ashamed, expecting a lecture about wasted potential. Instead, Elijah closed the door, and he told her his whole story, the desk and the letter and the library and the mop, all of it. And then he said, "I'm not going to tell you to choose your gift over your grandmother. I chose my family, and I would choose them again, and anyone who tells you your grandmother matters less than a theorem is a fool. But here is what nobody offered me, and what I am offering you." And he restructured the program's support, a stipend that would let her arrange care for her grandmother, a flexible path, a network, all the scaffolding that a poor genius needs and almost never gets. The scaffolding that, had it existed for Elijah in his 5th year, would have let him keep both his family and his life's work. "You don't have to choose," Elijah told her. "That's the whole point of my second act. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure kids like us don't have to make the choice that was forced on me. Now sit down and let's figure out how to keep your grandmother cared for and your name on your own proofs, because you are going to publish under your own name and I am going to live to see it." Deja did not drop out. She stayed, and her grandmother was cared for, and 3 years later she published a result of her own under her own name, and Elijah sat in the front row, and when it was announced he wept again, the way he had in the library 30 years before, except that this time the tears meant the exact opposite thing. And what about the marriage joke? People always want to know. And I'll tell you though, it is not the part that matters. No, Elijah Turner and Catherine Vaughn did not get married. That flippant, arrogant challenge was never a real thing, and both of them knew it. But something did grow between them, something better and stranger than the joke, a deep and genuine friendship between two people bound by an extraordinary mourning and by a shared consuming love of the beautiful abstract truths that mathematics is made of. Catherine became Elijah's closest colleague and fiercest advocate, and she said more than once that meeting the man she had tried to humiliate was the moment she stopped being merely brilliant and started slowly, painfully to become wise, and that it was the best thing that ever happened to her, and that she would carry the shame of that joke and the grace of his forgiveness together for the rest of her life as two halves of the same lesson. Elijah kept the mop. This is true. He had it mounted actually in his new office, a janitor's mop on the wall of a professor's office, and when students asked about it, he told them the whole story, and he always ended it the same way, and I'll end with it too. "I want you to look at that mop," Elijah would say, "and I want you to understand that for 30 years, the smartest thing in every room I cleaned was the person emptying the wastebasket, and not one of the brilliant people in those rooms ever once thought to wonder about him. That's not because they were cruel. Most of them were kind. It's because they had decided without ever deciding it that a man with a mop was a man with a mop and there was nothing else there to find. Don't ever do that. The person serving your coffee might be a poet. The woman cleaning your office might understand the universe better than your professors. The old man with the mop might have invented the thing you're building your career on. You do not know. You cannot know unless you stay curious enough and humble enough to look. And the day you decide you already know what a person is worth from the uniform they're wearing, you have stopped being a scientist, whatever your degree says. Because a scientist is someone who never stops asking what's really there. So here's what I want to leave you with tonight. The world is full of drowned geniuses. That is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration. It is the plainest fact about the society we have built. For every Elijah Turner who gets his one Tuesday morning in a lecture hall, there are thousands who never do, thousands of brilliant poor kids who had to choose their families over their gifts. Thousands of minds that could have changed some corner of the world. Mopping floors, driving trucks, waiting tables, emptying waste buckets unseen because we decided we already knew what they were worth from where they were standing. And the tragedy is not only that we lose their gifts, the tragedy is that so many of them, like Elijah, come to half believe the verdict themselves, to make their peace with the drowning, because the world has told them so completely and so long that a person with a mop is only a person with a mop. Do not accept that verdict about anyone, including yourself. If you are the one holding the mop, holding the gift you had to set down, believing your Tuesday morning will never come. I cannot promise you it will. But I can tell you that Elijah Turner believed the same thing for 30 years and was wrong, and that the mind that saw numbers like color never stopped being his no matter what the world called him. And if you are one of the people in the room, the brilliant ones, the ones with the degrees and the standing, then for God's sake stay curious about the quiet person at the edge of it, because you do not know you cannot know. And the day you decide you already do is the day you stop being able to see the most extraordinary thing that might ever walk into your lecture hall carrying a mop. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, because someone out there tonight is holding a mop and a gift they had to set down, believing their moment will never come, and they need to hear Elijah's story. Leave a comment and tell me, have you ever seen someone reveal a hidden brilliance the world had completely overlooked? I read every single one, and they stay with me for a long time. Until the next story, stay humble, stay curious. Keep asking what's really there, and never once decide that you already know what a person is worth from the uniform they happen to be wearing or the place they happen to be standing.